Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 16346 in the name of Alistair Allen on legislative consent motion, Great British Energy Bill, UK legislation. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Gillian Martin to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 6 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for this opportunity to debate the motion to provide legislative consent to the UK Government's Great British Energy Bill, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. After extensive engagement with the UK Government on certain clauses, we now propose that Parliament gives consent for the bill. As members may be aware, 3 government amendments were tabled only on Tuesday of this week, and we are currently considering these amendments and whether a further supplementary LCM is necessary. However, I'd like to stress that the Parliament's decision on legislative consent this evening will only cover the LCM from the 8th of August and the supplementary LCM lodged on the 28th of January. Since the bill's introduction, my officials and I have worked with the UK Government to address issues in the legislation that concern the constitutional position of the Parliament. I notice that Edward Mountain wants to make an intervention. Happy to take
intervention from Edward Mountain, who's joining us remotely. Mr Mountain.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, I didn't want to make an intervention. I wanted just to note that I wanted to speak. I misread the instructions on the keypad.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. That is clear. Cabinet Secretary.
Since the bill's introduction, my officials and I have worked with the UK Government to address issues in the legislation that concern the constitutional position of this Parliament. These discussions have centred around Clause 5 of the bill, which requires the Secretary of State to prepare a statement of strategic priorities for Great British Energy. As originally drafted, Part 4 of this clause stated that the Secretary of State must consult the Scottish Ministers before including a statement under this section, anything which concerns a subject matter provision about which would be within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament if contained in an Act of Parliament. Now, we were concerned that this clause merely compelled the UK Ministers to consult with the Scottish Government on GB energy strategic priorities, and we feel it's crucial that these priorities not diverge or conflict with Scottish objectives, such as it was imperative that the UK Government should seek consent of Scottish ministers in this area and not simply just consult. So I'm pleased to confirm that we have worked constructively with the UK Government on this, and they have recognised the need for this to be very clear. The ministers tabled an amendment to the bill on the 23rd of January, stipulating that the Secretary of State cannot include in a statement of strategic priorities anything within devolved legislative competence without the consent of Scottish ministers. And I also wrote to Minister Michael Shanks regarding Clause 6 of the bill, which enables the Secretary of State to give direction to GB Energy, and also states they must consult such persons as they consider appropriate. And I requested assurance that in practice, consultation with the Scottish Government would be included under Clause 6 provision. Pleased to inform Parliament I have received written assurance on the 23rd of January that the Scottish Government would be consulted where a direction related to a matter which is within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. These outcomes, which have come from open and constructive engagement between the two governments, show the benefits of a positive working relationship between administrations, and I am grateful to UK ministers and their officials for that approach. In the past few months, in parallel to our legislative discussions, my officials and I have worked with the UK Government to establish how GB Energy may further help Scotland seize the opportunity of the energy transition. We already have a very highly developed pipeline of renewables in Scotland. So as the company develops, I want to see what additionality they can provide, particularly for communities and nascent technologies. I will.
Stephen Kerr.
Giving way. I wonder in her discussions with UK ministers whether or not she's been able to discern exactly what the purpose of GB Energy is. Can she explain to the Chamber what it exists to do? Because we are at a complete loss at this end.
Cabinet Secretary.
This does seem to be a hot topic, and obviously I've had those discussions. Not just with ministers, but also with Jürgen Meyer as well. I think Jürgen Meyer set out very clearly what GB Energy is and isn't. This week. I think it's really a matter for Labour members to answer Mr Kerr as to whether or not what GB Energy maybe was purported to be previously to the election has actually come to fruition, and I am on record of having some concerns around that myself. However, on the substance of the bill, We are in agreement that we want to work with them in making sure that GB Energy does provide additionality and to what's already happening in the privately owned landscape. The UK Government have said they're looking for GB Energy to crowd in investment, including backing more nascent technologies of the sector, and that will be critical to reaching net zero. And we'll be able to share extensive knowledge of the Scottish energy sector to ensure support for clean energy production projects here in Scotland at the earliest opportunity. So I want to thank the UK Government for the constructive discussions around this. As I said, despite Scotland already having a strong pipeline of clean energy and growing supply chain opportunities, there are many opportunities still for Scotland to grasp as we advance our position as one of the world's leading countries in renewables energy. So, Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament agrees that all provisions in the Great British Energy Bill, introduced to the House of Commons on the 25th of July 2024 and subsequently amended so far as these matters fall within the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament and alter the executive competence of the Scottish Ministers, should be considered by the UK Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call on Edward Mountain on behalf of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased I'm now coming in at the right moment. And I'm pleased to contribute on behalf to the debate today on behalf of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. Before getting into the detail of the devolved elements of the bill, I'd like to outline some serious concerns about the process that the LCM has brought to light. We are debating this motion just barely 48 hours after the committee's report was published, leaving little time for anyone to consider our findings. I recognise the issues we experience in scrutinising LCMs are often unavoidable. We are part of a process taking place not only in this Parliament, but also in another Parliament with its own deadlines, with two governments negotiating in a way that we can't track. But parliamentary scrutiny too often falls victim to unsatisfactory process that sidelines committees. I strongly believe that committees should never be bystanders, providing a last-minute rubber stamp on intergovernment negotiations. We should be active participants. And to that end, I'd urge governments to work harder together to ensure that Parliament is given its proper constitutional role in this process. Our report sets out a clear position. When the Scottish Government lodges an LCM that sets out a holding position, they should lodge a more substantive LCM as soon as possible. And that should not wait until the final amendments are lodged. Committees need proper information at an early stage of their scrutiny so it can make an impact. Now, moving on to the detail of the bill, it was clauses 5 and 6 that raised issues. Clauses 5 requires the Secretary of State to prepare a statement on GB Energy's strategic priorities. Initially, the bill required that the Scottish Government should be consulted about this. The Scottish Government requested this be changed to require their consent. Intergovernment negotiations, as we've heard, went well, and the bill was amended in line with this request. The committee has often called for the governments to work together, so we're pleased to see this cooperation. Though I reiterate, we should have had a much clearer statement much sooner than we did about what the government was pursuing. Clause 6 of the bill grants the Secretary of State for power to issue directions to GB Energy. Both the committee and the Scottish Government received assurances this power would be really used in limited circumstances, for example, in relation to national security. But the bill provides no such limitations. We have also been assured that the UK Government will consult Scottish ministers before issuing directions that engage devolved interest. The government say they're content with the assurance offices, but the committee does remain concerned. If both governments agree that the Scottish Government should be consulted, we are unclear why this is not put on the face of the bill to provide a firm, permanent, legal footing rather than a non-binding assurance from the government of the day. Our report calls on the Scottish Government to request this change in whatever time remains of the process. With this one reservation, the committee did agree, by majority, to recommend consent. However, this underlines the importance of ensuring committees are involved early so their concerns don't end up sidelined because we've run out of time. And I urge the Scottish Government and the UK Government to do what they can to improve this in the future. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call on Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. GB Energy is a sham. The Prime Minister is taking my constituents for fools. The structure of GB Energy is absurd. And the promised jobs, it will take 20 years to deliver the 1,000 jobs. 20 years. And in the next 5 years, we can expect at most 200 jobs. This is not a credible plan for economic growth. Instead, it represents 20 years of pain and decline for the north east of Scotland, with tens of thousands of jobs lost as Labour shuts down the oil and gas sector without offering a meaningful replacement. Labour are blatantly attempting to hoodwink the public. Before the general election, Ed Miliband promised to cut energy bills by £300 through their net zero policy. What rubbish, and where is that promise now? So why would the Scottish Government wave this LCM through? Maybe because they don't have a plan for themselves. The Energy Strategy and Just Transition Plan are years late and still nowhere to be seen. The devolved SNP Government seemed content to agree to this LCM when the details of GB Energy are so thin on the ground. Presiding Officer, we already have 30 gigawatts of energy applications in the North Sea. GB Energy will have no impact on this investment. So I have to ask, what is the point? It's a political bung to try and placate the residents of Aberdeen. And how is all this energy going to be transported? By destroying our countryside and communities with monster pylons. The Labour Party wants to carpet bomb the countryside with pylons and substations, and this SNP devolved government are only too happy to supply the ammunition. Presiding Officer, we need to drill more wells, issue more licences and extract more oil. The economically illiterate socialists on that side of the chamber, supported by the extremist, unhinged Greens, have tried for years to destroy the livelihoods of my constituents. No one in Aberdeen is buying it. The pathetic and desperate attempt to throw the words just transition in front of everything we do with wind turbines or battery storage doesn't wash with my constituents in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. Oil and gas from the North Sea is good for Britain, good for Scotland, good for the environment, good for jobs. And this devolved SNP government like to talk about how we're the Saudi Arabia of renewables. What a lot of hot air. Why don't we talk about using all this oil and gas infrastructure that's been built up over years and generated billions of tax profits? I will give way to Bob Doris.
Bob Doris.
I thank my fellow committee member Douglas Lumsden for giving way. I was actually going to speak to the terms of the LCM at any point, rather than make a party political rant.
Too well that this LCM is about the creation of GB Energy that absolutely provides nothing for my constituents. And instead of supporting an industry that brings in money, GB Energy makes clear that we're doubling down on an industry that we subsidise through CFDs and constraint payments. I have nothing against building a renewable energy source, but why on earth aren't we supporting oil and gas extraction? GB Energy is a policy of national self-harm. Yet again, the nationalists and socialists are doing what Putin and his cronies want. And perhaps if the Labour Party took less money from eco-zealots and started talking to oil and gas workers, Anis Sarwar and Keir Starmer would know this and understand the truly existential issue in Aberdeen. Just as it was Harold Wilson who closed more coal mines than any other Prime Minister, Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister who shuts down the North Sea oil and gas industry. No one, and I mean no one, knows what GB Energy is going to do. Presiding Officer, I can tell you what it won't do. It won't stand up for oil and gas workers. It won't support oil and gas extraction, and it won't make bills cheaper. You know what makes bills cheaper? More domestic oil and gas production and drilling. And you know what? It has the side effect of providing secure, well-paid employment for years to come. And that is why my constituents need right now, not empty promises from the SNP or empty offices from the Labour Party. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I call Ms Boyack, I would just remind all members that language is very important, that we should strive to be courteous and respectful to one another. And I call on Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think there have been some constructive points made in the Chamber thus far this afternoon. particularly from the Acting Cabinet Secretary and the committee convener. But I have to say, Douglas Lumsden's utterly negative and inaccurate speech has not helped the work that we need to do in political parties across this chamber. And it has been a constructive dialogue between governments. It took a Labour government in Westminster to actually take the decisive steps to start delivering. I'll take a brief intervention.
Douglas Lumsden.
Jobs in Aberdeen. We've now been told that's going to take 20 years. So were we misled?
Sarah Boyack.
Utterly inaccurate to ignore the work that's happening already. It's just been months before we're actually here. The election was July, and here we are having practical discussions now. And we've already seen investments across the UK, a change in terms of renewables, new green investment that's happening in terms of industry. You can see those jobs starting, and there has been important progress. And I think with those who would read the committee report, you would see, no thank you, I'm actually going to give a positive comment about one of your contributions. When Michael Shanks spoke to the Net Zero Committee, he highlighted it's a different way of doing things in this country, ensuring clean, secure power, with public ownership and investment being key to make sure that all our communities have a stake in the future of our energy supply. Surely that is something that this Parliament must support, and making sure that we have energy security, benefits to our community, and tackle the climate crisis, creating new jobs. It's crucial. And actually, when you look at the official report and you look at what Jürgen Meyer is saying, GB Energy will incentivise new and emerging technologies such as marine renewables, floating offshore wind, so that we maximise the opportunities. We get the range of new clean energy and heat supplies, and critically supporting supply chains in Scotland and investment in green manufacturing. And we need a more joined-up approach. So it's not an exaggeration to say that GB Energy is absolutely essential for the future of the UK, with Scotland delivering new jobs in our communities and for the planet. I want to go back to the Scottish Government, the work that's been done between the two governments. It's important that we have governments that are serious about creating new jobs and tackling the climate emergency. But I would also add our local authorities are absolutely critical as well. If you look at our Nordic neighbours, if you look at European countries, you see a lot more in terms of municipal and cooperatively owned heat and power networks. We haven't had that yet in Scotland, and we need more leadership. So it's crucial that we get empowerment of our communities and local knowledge being spread. They're ready to go, but we're not getting enough from the Scottish Government. So that constructive approach between governments is critical. And I think the £3.3 billion, the money that's coming from the National Wealth Fund for community projects and investment, are absolutely critical. So we need to see delivery on the ground. A brief comment from Bob Doris.
Bob Doris.
I thank Sarah Boyack for giving way. It will be very brief. I'm just wondering if Sarah Boyack, in terms of the LCM, can understand why the majority of the committee preferred that under Clause 6, on the face of the bill, the Scottish Government would have the power in relation to the direction of GB Energy to be consulted and ideally to have to give its consent over devolved matters. The UK Government hasn't conceded on that point. That was the clear committee preference.
In conclusion, Ms Boyack.
Having looked at the committee discussions, as I said, intelligent questions were asked. There were questions for both the Acting Cabinet Secretary and for the Energy Minister, Michael Shanks. And the fact that we're here today with, hopefully, future clarity on those issues, I think, is critical. The points made by Edward Mountain were important. We need to make sure that we get effective accountability and scrutiny for any process we're putting through this Parliament. But the constructive dialogue we've seen so far, I think, is critical. And the whole Chamber should support the advent of GB Energy. The difference it's going to make. We live in an era when we're seeing climate denial. That is not acceptable. We need to work together. We don't have to agree on everything, but we need to support new investment in our country because our constituents need that, and they need it now.
Thank you. I now call on Mark Ruskell.
Thanks very much. Well, Scottish Greens will back the LCM at decision time tonight, but I do want to sound a note of caution because we have come through a period where devolution in Scotland and Wales has faced unprecedented attacks from the previous Westminster government. And intergovernmental ways of working in the UK are still largely based on precedent and goodwill, rather than actually being codified into legislation like most other countries which have a devolved context do. And ways of working like the Sewell Convention, based on those principles of respect, have been seriously undermined and contested in recent years to the point that they become almost meaningless. So, within the context of this bill, I really welcome the changes the Scottish Government have secured to embed a more consultative approach between administrations. But, there is still a danger of overreach from a future Westminster Government. And, of course, there will be a role for this Parliament to bring transparency around these relationships going forward. And I think, the convener made important points there about the role of committees within that. But, reflecting the evidence that we had in committee, clearly there's a sense that the Labour Government is working more collaboratively with Scottish ministers. I think that's very welcome. But despite all the bluster from Anna Sauer at FMQs today, when I asked Michael Shanks at committee about the role of GB Energy in promoting nuclear projects, he sounded pretty reasonable, and I'll quote what he said. He said, "Clearly we have a political difference on nuclear. There are no plans and there will be no engagement on that issue because it is clear that the Scottish Government would block those applications." That is the legitimate position that the Scottish Government has taken on that planning matter, and I do not think that there is a confrontation or a conflict on that. So that was real clarity. No new nuclear in Scotland. That's what Labour head office says. That's probably the best news the Labour backbenchers have had all week. Stephen Kerr, I think, raised a very valid question because it's still not really clear what GB Energy will actually do in Scotland, how many jobs it will create and how long it will take to do so. And I take on board Sarah Boak's point. It's early days. But what I do know for clarity is that there is a huge record of success in the development of renewable energy in Scotland, which is bringing down bills and it's keeping the lights on across the UK. And, for example, the onshore wind sector deal, which the Greens were proud to work on with SNP ministers during our time in government, is really now starting to help double the generation capacity in Scotland from onshore wind by 2030. And with that will come opportunities for community benefit and community ownership. And that's real energy security. I'm just closing. So I hope GB Energy will build on that success that we've had in Scotland, growing the economy in the right way to create green jobs that are really needed to make our energy needs going forward. And for those reasons, on balance, we will support the LCM at decision time tonight.
Thank you. I now call on Willie Rennie.
I've not been on the committee, I've not been immersed in the details of this, but I think there is quite a striking contrast with the relationship between this government and the last UK government and the current one. I think it's a step in the right direction. Of course, it's still clunky, as the convener of the committee has acknowledged. And I think Mark Ruskell is right. We do need to codify an awful lot of these relationships rather than relying on goodwill. And a federalist structure, perhaps, is finally the answer to this particular issue. But I want to talk about community benefit, which is something that was an important part of our discussions with the Scottish Government over the budget process. And those who are close observers will have noticed that there is, in our exchange of letters, we secured a commitment that only in extreme circumstances would the revenues from ScotWind be used for day-to-day spending, which was something that was in severe doubt earlier on this year, or last year, when the government were dipping into those resources in order to fund health and other services, which long-term would be a concern, because I think we need to use these revenues for economic benefit in communities, because the change that is coming is significant. If you look at even just the pump storage facilities that are coming in Perth and Kinross, Fleece and Galloway and the Highlands, they are going to require significant extra housing, improvements to roads, schools, but also health services in areas that are already struggling to cope with those kind of services. So we need to have a debate about how we use the revenues from ScotWind, but also from the community benefit revenues that come through many of the wind schemes, onshore and offshore, but also the pump storage, so that those communities can see a direct benefit now to cope with the pressures that will be faced now, but also will leave a lasting legacy. And that's where I think SSE have given an indication with the extra 1,000 houses that they're going to be building in order to help with the construction of their facilities. That gives an indication. I've actually only got 4 minutes, if it's okay. I just would like to try and get through a few other things. But that gives you an indication of the pressure that's going to come. And we should not see a restriction on the activities and the development in those areas because of those lack of local services and infrastructure. Which comes to the revenues themselves. There are two questions. How much do we secure from these schemes? And what do we use it for? And up until now, there has been significant investment in what you might call AstroTurf schemes, local facilities, local halls. And in some communities where they've seen already significant benefits, there are only so many AstroTurf pitches that you can actually put down. So what should we be using those resources for? And I would argue that we should be using it for the housing, the schools, the roads, etc., as a part of a leverage to get more resources into those communities. But how much? And this is something that Angus MacDonald, my colleague in the House of Commons, has been talking about. He has suggested a 5% level of the revenues of any particular renewable energy scheme should be ploughed back into that kind of community benefit. Now, I don't know whether that figure is right. I think for some it might work, for others it may not. But we should be debating how we can best use and get resources from those schemes in order to make sure that we can have lasting and immediate benefits for those areas. Because if you take communities like Shetland, where there is great aspirations to build tunnels between the islands rather than relying on ferries, there is a significant desire to secure that investment to make that lasting legacy. So I would hope that the Minister might respond to some of those remarks in her closing speech, because I would like to see the Government go further to make sure that we ring-fence, that we secure greater resources and we invest it in the right areas for a lasting legacy.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. I now call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up to 3 minutes, please. Point of order, Kevin Stewart.
My understanding, Presiding Officer, that in terms of the time allocated for the debate on this LCM, that there would be time for a contribution from the SNP backbenches. But that does not seem to be the case, and I'm wondering why that is not the case. Because I was going to be that speaker, and I wanted to highlight the fact that Jürgen Meyer this week, the chair of GB Energy, admitted that it would be 20 years before Aberdeen got 1,000 jobs. And couldn't put a date on when Labour's pledge to cut energy...
Mr Stewart, Stewart, those points that you have just raised are not, in fact, a point of order. So I will ask that you refrain from making them. Okay, Mr Stewart, if I am happy to address your query about timing, although it is not a point of order, the Parliament voted for a business motion which allocates a specific amount of time to a specific item. That happened. The Bureau, the matter was proposed at Bureau, agreed by Bureau, it came into the Parliament, it was voted on and accepted by all members, I would imagine, including those here. So this issue has not been raised until this moment, and the Parliament has allotted 30 minutes to this item, and we're taking up time that is taking away from that debate. So I would be grateful if we could proceed. A point of order, Stephen Kerr.
Recognising the genuine concern that Kevin Stewart has expressed about the importance of this debate and the time allocated to it, can I apply under the relevant standing order for the debate to be extended by 30 minutes?
Mr Kerr, thank you for your comments. At this point, I cannot agree to such a request. This item, the business of the week, is fully discussed at Bureau. It is then brought to the Chamber, where every member here has an opportunity to speak against or to oppose a motion that they are not content with. Therefore, I will not allow this to continue at this point, because that is discourteous to the vast majority of members. Briefly, Mr Kerr.
As a point of order. So under what circumstances it would be appropriate, as is done in other settings, for us to be able to extend the time allocated by virtue of a motion of the Parliament, to extend the debate by 30 minutes. And that is...
Mr Kerr, we are currently conducting an item of parliamentary business. We are not in this chamber at this moment to discuss how we run parliamentary business. I'm happy to do that with Mr Kerr or any other member in another setting. In this instance, it is not appropriate, and I am not going to think of hypothetical situations that I might address by allowing an extension of business. I now call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to thank members for their contributions today. And I know that there's a great deal to be discussed about what GB Energy is going to be and how it's going to be developed. And I want to be involved in those discussions because I do think that there is an issue here about what was promised. I will.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and I would like to be involved in that discussions too, because I want to ask and get clarity from the UK Government around about how many jobs for Aberdeen. We were promised 1,000, they're now saying 20 years before Aberdeen gets 1,000. They pledged to cut energy bills by £300. Jürgen Meyer couldn't give us a timescale on that either. It seems that the UK Government and GB Energy are failing to invest in the north east of Scotland, failing to invest in Scotland's renewable industries and failing to reduce energy costs for the public and businesses. I wish the Cabinet Secretary well in her discussions with the UK Government, and I hope that she can get answers to those questions that I and my constituents would like to have the answers to.
Cabinet Secretary.
Again, I do want to reiterate some of the comments I made in response to Stephen Kerr. I think it's for Labour members, and indeed those who were candidates and those on the benches to my right, to answer as to why promises were made about what GB Energy would do that are not going to come to fruition. I had doubt about that myself as we went into it. But I hope the Parliament votes to give consent to all clauses within the bill, because I want us to work on the development of this project in good faith. I want GB Energy to work alongside the Scottish Government and Scottish public bodies to support community and local energy projects which are vital for Scotland's economic growth and net zero ambitions. I know that I don't have much time, but I do want to mention some of the things that Willie Rennie, who is not in his seat at the moment, mentioned on community benefits. This is a separate stream of work that I am doing to encourage the UK Government to mandate community benefits for all projects. He is absolutely right. They have to be legacy benefits. They have to be looking at the infrastructure required. That's a separate stream of work. I don't see GB Energy as being part of that work. We want all Scottish consumers to be able to rely on affordable, sustainable, secure energy for years to come. I am hopeful that GB Energy can play a valuable part in pursuing that goal. But, Presiding Officer, I will leave it there because I move that Parliament backs the motion and grants legislative consent to all clauses within the bill.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on legislative consent motion, Great British Energy Bill, UK legislation. It is now time to move on to the next item of business, and there are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 16353, in the name of Jenny Minto, on improving miscarriage care, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 16346, in the name of Alistair Allen, on legislative consent motion, Great British Energy Bill, UK legislation, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access digital voting.